Hello, and welcome to my world of conversation around math topics. My name is Hardy-Soto. I'm the Director of Mathematics for iLead Schools, and today's topic is integers, or the basics of integers. We're going to do some combination, adding and subtracting. So the first thing you need to understand about integers is the concept of zero. In the dictionary, we find the figure or symbol zero, which in the Arabic notation for numbers, stands for the absence of a quantity. So let's talk about what that means. If we have a quantity, we have something added, and then we take that thing away, essentially we have nothing. That's what zero means. It's the absence of quantity. There's nothing. And we can represent that with a plus and a minus, because if you add one and take it away, you're at zero. If you give someone $1 and then you take it back, now they have $0. Okay. The second thing you need to understand is that you can add as many zeros as you like. It will not change your initial value. So let's say your initial value is 5. You do 5 plus 0, you're still going to have 5. You do 5 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0, you're still going to have 5. 5 plus 5 zeros, you're still going to have 5. And this is true for subtracting zeros as well. 5 minus 0 is still going to be 5. And you can do a combination. 5 plus 0 minus 0 plus 0. Whenever you start with an initial value, you can add or subtract as many zeros as you want. And because it's essentially nothing, you're going to end up still with that initial value, in this case, 5. Okay, now let's talk about how we'll be representing integers in this video. Let's say we have a positive 4. There's no negative in front of it. We know it's positive. We will be representing a positive 4 with 4 plus signs, or 4 positives. Similarly, we will represent a negative 7 with 7 negatives. So negatives will represent negative numbers, positives will represent positive numbers, and we'll do as many as the number is. And finally, 0 will be represented with a plus and a minus together, because again, when you add one and take one away, they cancel each other out and they become 0. But keep in mind that we can do as many zeros as we want, and it will still be 0. And we're going to have to use that later on. You'll see where. Okay, so the easiest way to understand the basics is to work through some examples. So let's jump right in. Let's start with negative 8 plus 5. Now remember, how would we represent negative 8? Well, we would have 8 negatives. And then how would we represent positive 5? Well, we would have 5 positives. So negative 8 plus 5 is actually, you're going to see here that we created some zeros, a plus and a minus. That's zeroed out, that's zeroed out, that's zeroed out. And so what do we have left? We have negative 3. And so that's your answer. Negative 8 plus 5 is negative 3. Okay, let's try another one. Let's do 6 minus 2. Now this seems really, really simple. You're used to regular subtraction, so this should be easy for you. You might even be able to look at this and say, it's 4. I know it's 4. I don't have to do anything for it. But where problems like this get tricky is people always ask me, is this a minus or a negative? And so I'm going to show you both ways. I'm going to show you it as 6 plus a negative 2, because we can always put a plus in between when we're combining two things, right? So 6 plus negative 2, we're going to call this a negative. And then we'll do 6 minus a positive 2, and we'll consider it as a minus. Okay, so let's do it. If we have 6 plus negative 2, we represent the 6 with 6 positives, and then we throw in 2 negatives. Again, you can see, just like before, we created some zeros here. So those are going to cancel and go away, 0 out essentially, and we have left 4 positives. That's our answer, and it matches your initial gut check, right? Now let's try it this way. We have 6 positives, and then essentially we're going to take away 2 of those positives. So I'm going to represent take away with a scribble. Okay, so we're going to take away 2 of those positives. What do we have left? We have 4 as well. So whether you use that sign in the middle as a negative, as we did over here, or a minus, as we did here, it will be the same thing. It will come out the same. Okay, let's try another one. People get mixed up sometimes with the minus in the middle. So let's try what that would look like. We have negative 7. Let's start with our representation of negative 7. So we have 7 negatives there. And then we're going to take away 3 negatives. So again, using my scribble, I take away 3 negatives. What do I have left? Negative 4. That's it. That's the answer to this problem too. So it's a lot simpler than it seems. Sometimes it looks scary. It's not too bad. Okay. Now this is where it's going to get a little more difficult, and I'll show you why. We're starting here with 4 positives. Let's represent that. And then what is this telling me to do? It's telling me to take away 3 negatives. And you're like, what? There's no negatives there. How can I take away 3 negatives if there's no negatives? Well, this is where that part that I talked about in the beginning is coming into play. Remember, we said we can add as many zeros as we want, and it wouldn't change the initial value. So when we add these zeros, this is still just positive 4. We didn't change the problem. But now we want to take away 3 negatives. So let's do that, because now we have them from the zeros. And what ends up happening? Now we have 7 positives. And you may have heard people say, oh, when the 2 negatives are next to each other, you just make it a plus. But I want you to understand why, because what you're doing is you're taking away negatives, which makes it become more positive. Okay, let's try another one. -2 minus 5. Now I did this on purpose so we could again try that using it as a minus and using it as a negative thing. So first I'm going to use it as a negative on this side, and then I'm going to use it as a minus on this side. Let's go. So the -2 is represented with 2 negatives. And then you're going to add 5 more negatives. So what do we have? We have 7 negatives, plain and simple. That's actually a pretty easy way to see it. This one, we have 2 negatives, and we're going to take away 5 positives. But again, you can say we don't have 5 positives to take away. And again, we can add zeros whenever we want. It doesn't change the problem. Notice I'm going to do them upside down here. On the last problem, it was plus on top, minus on the bottom. It doesn't matter because the plus and minus cancel each other out either way. But I'm going to add 5 of these because I need to be able to take away 5 positives. Okay. So now I've done that, but this is still just -2 plus a whole bunch of zeros. But now I'm going to subtract 5 positives. There we go. And what do we have left? -7, the same thing we had over here. So it works out the same way. So as you work on these problems, I want you to notice, pay attention to the trends, and then think about why. What's happening in each problem to make it that way? So all of these problems that I'm bringing up now are just the exact same problems we just did. So these aren't anything new. If you want to go rewind back, you'll see these are the same problems we just did. But I want you to think about it in terms of negatives and positives. I want you to pretend there's this cauldron with a whole bunch of positive and negatives floating around in there, okay? And then I want you to think about if we had 8 negatives and then we put 5 negatives together in the cauldron, what's going to happen? Well, we know that the positives and the negatives are going to cancel out. So the numbers are going to get smaller. But then we think about, but which one did we have more of? We had more negatives. We had 8 negatives and 5 positives. So since we had more negatives, my answer is going to be negative. And since they're canceling out, we're subtracting. So we would get the 8 minus 5 to get the 3, and we say 8's bigger, so we would have more negatives. Does that make sense? Same thing here. I have 6 positives, and then I take 2 of those positives away. But 6 was bigger to start off with, so even though I take 2 of the positives away, I'm still going to have 4 positives left over. Same thing here. If I start with 7 negatives, and then I take away 3 of those negatives, I have less negatives now because I took some away, but the 7 was bigger than the 3. So I had more negatives to start, even though I took 3 away. And that's why I ended with -4. Same thing here. I start with 4 positives, but then I'm taking away negatives out of this cauldron. Anytime you take negatives out, you're making it more positive. So you know this is going to get more positive, and it did. And finally, if I have 2, and then I subtract 5 positives. Well, I had 2 positives to start, so I take those 2 out, but then I still have to go 3 more, so I end up going negative. Does that make sense? And actually, I lied to you. This is a -2. So 2 negatives and then 5 more negatives. It gets even more negative, so it's -7. All right, I want to give you a few problems, and I don't want you to think of what the answer is. I just want you to think, would it be positive or negative? So let's try that. So if I have -3 plus 7, one thing I want you to be careful of, sometimes because we get so used to doing things automatically, our brain just jumps there automatically. So you might see this and go, oh, 3 plus 7 is 10, and there's a negative in front, it's -10. And you need to learn to slow yourself down. Don't let your brain jump to that because that's not right here. So here we're going to have 3 negatives and then 7 positives. So they're going to cancel out. If they cancel out, that means there's less of them. Okay. But which one did we have more of? We had more of the 7. So more of the positives. So that means our answer is going to be positive. And if you think through it, it's going to be positive 4 because we take away 3 of those positives with the negatives. Okay. Now on this one, I have 2 positives, and then I'm going to take out 1 negative out of my cauldron that all these positives and negatives are rolling around. I have 2 positives, and I'm going to take out a negative. That means it's going to be more positive. So that means where that 1 negative I took out, there's a positive left in the cauldron that's going to make it even more. So this would be a positive 3. Here I have 4 negatives and then 5 more negatives. So we just added negatives and negatives. And so that becomes negative 9. Okay. That's easy to tell that the answer would be negative because we're just negatives on top of negatives. Now on this one, it's negative 8 minus negative 6. So you have 8 negatives and you're pulling 6 negatives away, but the 8 is bigger. So even though you're pulling negatives away, we're still going to have negatives left over in the end. So this answer will still be negative. And then finally, 5 minus 9. If I have 5 positives and I want to take away 9 positives, well, I can take 5, but then I don't have any left to take. So now I'm dipping into the positives that are aligned with the negatives, and it goes down into the negatives. Okay, does that make sense? So there are rules. A lot of times teachers will say, like, if they're both the same sign, then you add them. But I feel like what happens, because then in multiplication, it's like a negative times a negative is a positive, everybody gets confused. So I am okay with you making up your own rules, but make sure that you try some trial and error to see what would happen to come to that conclusion. Okay. All right, finally, I just want to show you real quick. I don't want to make this video too long, but this does work with multiplication and division too. So if you have 3 times negative 4, that's essentially telling me you have negative 4, but we want to do it 3 times. So here's 1 time, 2 times, and 3 times. So what do we have now? Now we have negative 12, plain and simple. Let's try another one with a negative and a negative, because this gets confusing too for people. All right, this is essentially telling me I want to take away negative 4 3 times. I want to take away negative 4 3 times. But again, we don't have any yet. So we have to add in all of our zeros. Now, I happen to know 3 times 4 is 12, so I put 12 zeros, but you can add as many as you want. This would still work, okay? I'm just trying to be efficient here. So we're going to take away negative 4 3 times. So here's 1 time. I'm taking away negative 4 1 time. Now I'm taking negative 4 away 2 times. And now I'm taking negative 4 away 3 times. And what do I have left? I have positive 12. So similarly, when you're taking away groups of negatives, your answer is going to be positive. And finally, with the division, negative 6 divided by negative 2. So I'm starting with 6 negatives. And remember, division is about groups of. So I want to group this together in groups of negative 2. Well, here's 1 group, here's 2 groups, and here's 3 groups. So my answer is 3. It gets a little trickier when it's a positive over a positive divided by a negative, or vice versa. But I want to work it backwards with you a little bit. So let's have our 8 positives. And I want us to pretend this were a multiplication problem. We want to end up with 8 positives. So we have to take away groups of negative 4. How many groups of negative 4 will we have to take away to get to 8 positives? Now you might be able to see it if I fill in those zeros for you. And now I can see, look, I have 1 group of negative 4 that I took away, 2 groups of negative 4 that I took away. So it's going to be negative 2 because I took away 2 groups of negative 4. Does that make sense? Okay, I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you go home today and practice. And as always, happy mathing.